Okay, today's video has been a long time coming. These are the latest paddles from a company called PaddleTek. And in case you're not aware, PaddleTek is a pickleball company that's been around a long time, way before the sport's recent growth spurt that started a few years ago. In fact, I just glanced over at the paddles approved by USAP, and PaddleTek's got ones listed on there from over a decade ago. So they really have been at this for a while now. However, it wasn't until recently that their paddles have been getting quite a bit of traction in the review circuit, and it's pretty exciting because they seem to be doing stuff differently over there. So today, we're looking at the updated Bantam ALW-C series in 14.3 and 12.7 millimeters, and then we have the new Bantam ESQ-C paddles also in 14.3 and 12.7 millimeters. And before checking these paddles out, I knew very little about PaddleTek and their paddle lines. And to be honest, I found their naming conventions and paddles pretty hard to follow, and I imagine I'm not the only one. All I knew was that some major pro players absolutely destroyed with PaddleTek's paddles in their hands, but that wasn't nearly enough information for me to figure out if there's a paddle in their arsenal right for me. So in this video, I'm going to break down their most recent releases and try and help folks figure out which, if any, would be a good fit for them and their play style. And to be upfront, these paddles are not for everyone. If you're someone that's fully focused on a slow, control-oriented dinking game with a lot of resets and not too many speed-ups and want a super control-focused paddle, consider checking out this video where I cover my favorite control paddle of the year called the Terra TC14 Pro from another Michigan-based company called Temper. And for me, testing these PaddleTeks and a few other power paddles that have been released over the past month or two is actually one of the reasons I'm so behind on uploads, because I've actually always been a control lover, and I've played almost exclusively with all-court paddles for pretty much the entire time I've played pickleball. And switching to testing the new power paddles coming to market and figuring out their nuances really took me some time, and I've got a lot of thoughts to share. And to get out of the way up top, these kinds of paddles have actually completely changed my game, and I'm going to get into all the nitty-gritty in a bit. But before we get too much farther into things, I wanted to let you know PaddleTek is letting me give one of these babies away for free, so be sure to stick around to the end of the video to see how to enter. But if you want to get a head start, you can go ahead and subscribe and hit that notification bell. And I also wanted to let you know I'm working on a video of my favorite pickleball accessories, so that's another reason to subscribe, because you really won't want to miss that. If you want a sneak peek, I've got a list down in the video description of a lot of the gear I've been testing out, so don't be afraid to click around. On top of that, I've now put together a list of some of my favorite pickleball gear you can find on Amazon just in time for the holidays. And there's some real hidden gems in there for anyone jonesing to add something to their bag right away. I'll include a link to that down there as well. And now, let's get into it. First, I wanted to start with my favorite of the whole series, and arguably the one that's best for control players, and that's the Bantam ESQ-C in 12.7 millimeters. This is a standard shaped paddle. Its face material is T700 raw carbon fiber with a bottom layer of fiberglass, and that's according to paddle guru John Q. It's a cold press paddle with targeted perimeter weighting. It's a Gen 1 construction with a polypropylene core, but this core has 10 millimeter cells according, once again, to paddle guru John Q. It's 15.9 by 8 inches. It has a 5.5 inch handle. The grip circumference is 4.25 inches. The average weight is 7.6 to 7.9 ounces. The swing weight is 103. The twist weight is 6.6. And then it seems that this paddle often comes with a free gift. In the past, it would include a paddle cover and a hat. But for Black Friday, they did a free Genesis Pro paddle, which was pretty bonkers. And then PaddleTek offers a limited lifetime performance guarantee, so be sure to register. And then there is a 30-day return window. As for price, the paddle is $250, and unfortunately, PaddleTek has discontinued discount codes, but using my affiliate link will help support the channel with a small commission, so that would be super appreciated. And this paddle is USAP approved. And then this paddle comes in a slightly thicker version at 14.3 millimeters, and is advertised as having the same static weight as the thinner 12.7 millimeter version. However, for me, its 107 swing weight had a bit more punch compared to the 103 of the 12.7 millimeter version. And then the two versions have super comparable twist weights, with the 14.3 getting a tiny 0.1 bump up to 6.7 compared to its thinner sibling, and those stats are according to Dinkbase. Aside from that, the 14.3 millimeter version is constructed the same way and comes in at the same $250 price point. And then it does historically include a free gift. In the past, once again, it was a paddle cover and a hat, but for Black Friday, they actually switched to a free Genesis Pro paddle when you purchase this, which once again was pretty crazy. And still, while there are no longer discounts available for PaddleTek gear, if you decide to purchase one using my affiliate link in the description, you'll be supporting the channel, as I'll be able to collect a small commission. And once again, that's appreciated. Okay, so before I get into how these paddles perform, I really want to talk about what makes these paddles so unique design-wise. And figuring all this out was kind of tricky, so I hope this explainer helps some folks out. First, these paddles are Gen 1 paddles, meaning they're manufactured via a cold press process, while most paddles that hit super hard are Gen 2 or Gen 3 paddles, which utilize heat pressing and thermoforming when they're being manufactured. And I talk a bit about the different construction methods of paddles and how they generally affect performance in my Nexus Pro Start Bargain Gen 3 paddle review for anyone that wants to get a bit more info. But to really boil things down, pickleball paddles started to get made using heat and thermoforming techniques, as well as foam injected around the core and now inside the core relatively recently. And these methods typically lead to paddles that play hotter and hit harder compared to old school Gen 1 cold press paddles, the style of paddles that dominated the game for a really long time and very much informed how pickleball was played on a strategy level as well. But all that's changing right now, and we're going to get to that. However, the point I want to make right now is that PaddleTek's paddles are a real outlier for Gen 1 paddles. While they're using the old cold press construction method, their paddles play super hot and hit way harder than tons and tons of Gen 2 paddles and even some Gen 3 paddles, which is just super crazy. So let's go over what's going on. First, from what I've been able to gather internet sleuthing and testing things out for myself, is that PaddleTek is using a layer of fiberglass in the bottom of its face composition underneath the carbon fiber. And this is according to paddle review guru John Q, who's identified PaddleTek's advertised PT07 matrix stabilization layer as being fiberglass. And this is actually a known technique and is used to get more power and pop from a paddle. It was pretty common as a full-on surface choice with Gen 1 paddles, and then companies like 11624, Chorus, and even Honolulu Pickleball with the J2H and J1H paddles have been combining a stiffer feeling fiberglass layer with other face materials to add some extra pop and power on harder strikes. But that alone can't really explain the degree of power and pop PaddleTek's Gen 1 paddles are getting, in my opinion. And that brings me to the other thing PaddleTek is doing differently, and it's the thing I think is most interesting and was also a bit confusing to me. And that's what they're doing with their core. Instead of using honeycomb with the traditional 8mm cells that we see in almost all paddles, PaddleTek, once again, according to John Q, is using honeycomb with wider cells coming in at 10mm instead of 8. And that's something I hadn't seen until PaddleTek did it. And I've been a big fan of paddles using cores with non-traditional cells for a while now. I talk a ton about how smaller cells feel and play in my review of some really cool paddles from Bantam Pickleball, in case you want to check that video out. However, the paddles from PaddleTek are the first ones I've hit with that go the other direction and have cells that are bigger. And that seems to be a major contributing factor to why these paddles hit so hard, even though they're Gen 1 paddles. And at first, I really didn't have a good explanation for what was going on, because my understanding was that smaller cells, not bigger cells, meant denser cores and more power. So why is this paddle with wider cells and a less dense core producing so much freaking heat? And then I heard Justin, aka Pickleball Etc., explain it really well in a recent episode of Lewis's podcast over on the Pickleball Pursuit channel. And to distill it, it seems that PaddleTek's choice of 10mm cells also means it's a choice of polypropylene that's more flexible than most cores out there with 8mm cells. And this particular core type has usually been avoided with thermoform paddles that get heated up and baked because it can cause durability issues. But don't forget, PaddleTek's paddles aren't thermoform, so that is not much of a concern for them. And ultimately, what seems to be going on is that this core is a more flexible material than most other cores with 8mm cells. So this wide 10mm cell core has a springiness that seemingly helps push the ball off the face with some extra zip. At least that's what I think is going on, and I also think that's what Pickleball Etc. described as happening as well. And while I think this is the biggest contributor to these paddles' power, PaddleTek's doing one more thing of note, and that's placing targeted weight in the sidewalls of the paddle's core to try and widen the sweet spot out a bit, and probably add some more punch as well. And this is different from the edge foam we typically see in Gen 1.5 and Gen 2 paddles, where there's foam injected around the entire perimeter of the paddle to add power and pop while also widening out the sweet spot. Instead, what PaddleTek is doing is more like what you do when you add lead or tungsten to targeted areas of the paddle, but they're just doing it for you and putting it inside the core, which might make it even more effective. I'm really not sure. But that's a summary of what all is going on with how these paddles are made. But what does this mean for how they perform? Well, if I hadn't made it clear by now, I should really emphasize now that all of the new PaddleTeks have a ton of power and a ton of pop. Each of the little innovation tricks I just covered that might seem minor on their own are doing a lot in aggregate, creating Gen 1 paddles that are some of the hardest hitting, poppiest paddles you can get. And that's including Gen 2 and even Gen 3 paddles. And once again, that's just crazy. And you can even hear the difference when you hit with these paddles. They have a unique thunk noise, especially before they're broken in, that really highlights how different they are. And while these things really are rocket launchers, I think you still have good placement control because the surface is some of the spinniest I've ever played with. And while there's insane pop, that Gen 1 construction does give you a good hold on the ball that lets you add a ton of spin. You just don't have a lot of time to do it. And before I talk too much more on how the paddles play, I do want to bring the ALW-C versions into the conversation as well. As for specs, they're both pretty similar to the ESQ-C versions. They have all the same tech we've been talking about, with the main difference from the ESQ-C versions being these versions are a little wider, but with a head that's slightly taller, as well as a handle that's a 1/4 of an inch shorter at 5.25 inches. As for the ALW-C and 12.7 millimeters in particular, this is the paddle designed with Leigh Waters, who's one of the biggest pro players in the game. And aside from the shape differences for the ESQ-C versions, the 12.7 ALW-C has a slightly higher swing weight at 104 while having a very comparable twist weight at 6.61 when compared to its 12.7 ESQ-C counterpart. And once again, these stats are according to Dinkbase. And then the 14.3 ALW-C is a tad lighter than its 14.3 ESQ-C counterpart, but has virtually the same swing weight and twist weight according to Dinkbase. And both ALW-C versions are also at the same $250 price point as the ESQ-C models. And once again, while PaddleTek no longer offers discounts, if you use my affiliate link, you'll be supporting the channel with a small commission, which is super appreciated. And with that out of the way, the thing to highlight performance-wise is that the ALW-C versions are a bit more aggressive in play style compared to the ESQ-C versions. And this seems to be intended as PaddleTek advertises the ESQ-C versions as being for defensive play, while they do not say that about the ALW-C ones. But to be clear, the ESQ-C versions are not control paddles. They are definitely power paddles all day long. But I would agree that overall they are easier to manage, but not by a ton. More than anything, I think the slightly wider face of the ESQ-C versions gives you a little bit more forgiveness compared to the ALW-C paddles, but it's definitely subtle. And to be honest, if you have a hard time hitting the sweet spot, none of these paddles would be the best choice for you. And that's a nice transition to the most important question. Which one of these paddles, if any, should you pick up? And that's actually a little tricky to answer. It's a mix of understanding how each of these paddles performs compared to one another, but also really understanding how you perform as a player yourself. As I said at the top of the video, I'm historically a control-leaning player that's mostly been playing with all-court paddles for a really long time. However, like lots of folks playing pickleball these days, I've definitely observed the game getting faster and harder hitting with all the new power-oriented PaddleTek coming out. And the game is getting kind of erratic as well, especially with random matchups at open play. And it really does feel like a losing battle sometimes trying to do drops, resets, and transition things to a dinking game when the folks on the other side of the net are blasting balls just about at eye level the whole time. And yes, I know stepping out of the way and letting balls fly is the way to go, but as a reviewer, I'm sometimes doing whatever I can to get touches and hits in at open play to see what any given paddle can do. So it's a difficult habit for me to build if I'm being super honest. I just want to hit the dang ball. On top of that, all this is compounded if you have a random partner that might be at a lower level who's popping balls up on a silver platter every chance they get for the bangers on the other side of the net to just destroy. And so when I started testing these paddles out, I actually began with the 14.3 ESQ-C first, which I initially thought would be the most control leaning one, as well as the 12.7 ALW-C, which I thought would be on the other end of the power pop spectrum. And coming from a control mindset, I immediately wanted to tone the pop down of both paddles. For the 14.3 ESQ-C, the spot I found that I liked best was pretty low on the throat. And then for the 12.7 ALW-C, I like the weight a tad higher, coming up around the shoulders a bit. As for the weight I use with these paddles, I went with the pre-cut 3-gram tungsten strips you can get from Enhanced Pickleball called balance pods. And while this tuning tape does cost a little bit more than Bodie's tungsten tape, which is what I usually use because it comes in both 0.5 gram per inch and 1 gram per inch versions and is really good value, I like how the balance pods let you be super targeted because of their tiny footprint that really concentrates where the weight is added, and also happens to be the exact same size as the old school pre-cut lead tape we all used to use. Plus, they're super easy to peel off and adjust as you're figuring out where you want to place them, which was pretty important to me when setting these paddles up in particular. I have links for both kinds of weight down in the video description, and promo code MatthewK should get you a discount with either company. And I did a lot of testing and playing with these two paddles weighted up like this, as well as a few other power paddles for probably a month or so. And what I found was that my game dramatically changed. I talk about this a bit in my recent J2K and J2K Pro 14mm video, which also features some play footage for anyone curious, which I do plan to include in more videos moving forward. Anyway, testing power-oriented paddles and having so much pop and power at my fingertips, especially with the PaddleTeks in particular, really pushed me to play more aggressively than I ever had in the past. Instead of trying to stretch points out, which is hard to do across from bangers anyway, I started to bang myself. I was driving hard, chomping at the bit for overheads, punching instead of resetting, and was just playing a lot more aggressively than I ever had. Was I playing my best? I'm not sure. It's really hard to say. Points were often a lot shorter, and I had my fair share of forced errors, but I was having a lot of fun. And I will say again that these paddles, surfaces, and their spin just let you do a lot with ball placement, especially if that's a skill you've been honing by focusing on a control game. So after playing with these two and some other power paddles, I moved to testing the remaining PaddleTeks, the 12.7 ESQ-C and the 14.3 ALW-C. And what was interesting was I didn't feel the need to add weight at all to tone the pop down. I played with them stock, with the only modification being how I set my grip up, which to be fair is its own process altogether. And if you're curious, I covered that extensively in my Honolulu J3K video from a while back. But basically I build my grip up to 4.5 inches circumference, which also ends up adding quite a bit of weight to the handle. And so after having played almost exclusively with power paddles for over a month, I think my style had become so aggressive and focused on ending points rather than prolonging them. The nuances of the pop and the short, soft dinking game wasn't a factor that I noticed quite as much when I got to testing these two, which is crazy because that is the one paddle attribute that I have always obsessed over when it comes to testing and trying out paddles for basically forever. And so what does this all mean? Are any of these paddles for you? Well, if you're wanting a full control style of play where you're focusing on drops, resets, trying to slow the game down, initiate dinking, and then waiting for your opponent to make a mistake, even with weight, none of these paddles are probably the best choice for you. That is, unless you want to change your game. If you want to dip your toe into the dark side of the banging world, these really are great options. I love that they all have lower swing weights, especially the 12.7mm versions, and feel super quick in the hands. They're so light you could customize for days if that's what you really want to do. And so my recommendation for anyone interested in choosing between these paddles is pretty simple. I say go for the 12.7mm versions and choose which shape you prefer. For me, I gravitated towards the 12.7 ESQ-C. Maybe it was because it seemed slightly more forgiving because of that wider shape, but I also think that little bit of extra room on the handle makes whips easier, and that's a big part of my game. And then it's also the one with the lowest swing weight, barely nudging out the 12.7 ALW-C for that honor, and I really have an affinity for paddles that feel fast in the hands. As for the thicker versions, I think they're a tad trickier to recommend. I did enjoy my time with the weighted up 14.3 ESQ-C whenever I played with it, especially when I was still trying for my old control style of play. However, there are way better control paddles out there, so I don't really see a point to force a square peg into a round hole. As for the stock 14.3 ALW-C, I never found myself grabbing that one compared to the 12.7s. By the time I got to testing it out, I had really fallen for the speed of the thinner versions. However, if you want a little more driving power at the sacrifice of some hand speed, you could definitely consider the 14.3 ALW-C, but I would say these paddles really hold a special place as lightweight, super fast in the hands power paddles in my opinion. And since that's what I think makes the series so unique, I'd say stick with the thinner ones if you're considering purchasing one. But that means you're going to have to really embrace the idea of a banger play style and focus on a fast-paced game where you're setting the speed of things and aiming to score, not where you're trying to slow things down and wait for your opponent to make an error. These paddles are not about being patient, in my opinion. I really think they're best for players that want to be aggressive and force the ends of points. That's the headline for me. And before I get into value and wrap things up, I wanted to talk a bit about today's featured accessory. Today's accessory is actually a cleaner for your paddle face. This is a spray cleaner from a company called Reset. And while the topic on how to best clean paddles is a little divisive, especially amongst reviewers and pickleball gearheads, here's my take. For carbon fiber face paddles, but not ones with the spray-on grit, a normal paddle eraser will do the job really well. You can get those just about anywhere, and I'll be sure to include a link below. Those big chunks of rubber do a really good job at grabbing all the little bits of plastic and dirt that get adhered to your paddle face as you make contact with the pickleball, and then it peels all that junk and crud away. And that's how you get a paddle looking really new. Unfortunately, those are not a good choice for paddles that don't have raw carbon fiber faces. For paddles that use spray-on grit, an eraser can actually damage the face and texture, and while some folks disagree with me, I personally do not recommend erasers for paddles with Kevlar or titanium faces because you do risk damaging your paddle if you have the bad luck of having a loose thread on your face. I've actually experienced this with a Kevlar paddle before, and while some folks argue that the peel ply layer of those paddles is just like what's on raw carbon fiber face paddles, and so loose Kevlar or presumably titanium threads are the result of a manufacturing problem, that knowledge does little to help you if you have the misfortune of having a paddle that has a thin spot of peel ply with a thread poking out. If an eraser happens to grab that thread, you'll very likely damage your paddle even more. And while you might be able to warranty it, that's going to be a lot of hassle, and I'm betting a lot of companies won't be too excited to help out in that event as well. So I personally recommend using a microfiber cloth and a cleaner like Reset on basically any paddle that isn't raw carbon fiber, although it works really well in those kinds of paddles as well. And while you can also use a spritz of water as a cleaner, I think Reset does a really good job at loosening up any grime and ball residue that's built up on the face, and I think it's definitely worth adding a bottle to your bag. After promo code MatthewK, it's only a little over $10 and should last you a really, really long time, so I highly recommend giving it a try. Also, if you've used Reset before, please comment down below what you think about it. As for PaddleTek's latest releases, we should talk about one last thing: value. Personally, I really do think $250 is a bit up there price-wise, but I see folks bringing Gearbox Pros and the latest Yolas to open play all the time, so if you're one of those players with that sort of paddle budget, go for it. I definitely recommend them. You won't find a paddle this lightweight with this much punch and power anywhere else, in my opinion. Also, since these paddles are Gen 1, that means they should be super durable. Unlike Gen 2 and Gen 3 paddles constructed with heat, which can often lead to structural issues that can cause delamination or core crushing, the cold press PaddleTek paddles shouldn't experience this, at least not for the same reasons. Additionally, my understanding is that PaddleTek's paddles are made in the US, so I would think that would translate to easier and presumably better quality control. Also, the fact that PaddleTek offers a limited lifetime warranty makes me think these durability conclusions are pretty solid. Very few paddle companies offer lifetime warranties of any sort, so PaddleTek is definitely standing behind their products. Now, with all that being said, if you're more budget conscious, there are a few other power paddles to consider. I think Chorus's Fire paddles in particular should be on your radar, as well as the Neonic Flare Prime X, and then the Spartus Olympus is one to look at as well. I should have reviews of all those paddles on the channel pretty soon, hopefully before the end of the year holidays. And then I think Honolulu's Pro paddles with their Kevlar Power Weave are often overlooked in this category as well. As for the PaddleTek giveaway, this one is a little different. Like always, you need to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and comment which version you're most excited about and why, as well as fill out the Google form in the description so I have a way to contact you if you win. But this time, you'll also need to follow my Instagram at MatthewKPickle to be eligible to win one of the PaddleTeks. I'll include a link to my Instagram account in the description as well as the Google form. And I'll pick a winner in about a month, so be on the lookout for an email. Good luck. And that's pretty much all I've got. I really do think these new PaddleTeks are very, very unique. If price isn't a huge concern and you want super fast hands with a crazy light paddle that has more pop and power than most folks should ever have with some super punctuated dwell time and wicked spin, definitely go for one of these. And wow, I know this was a long video, so I appreciate you sticking around until the end. If you found this review helpful, please consider using promo code MatthewK on your next paddle purchase to help support the channel. I have a lot of the popular brands listed below, and my master list has even more. Once again, PaddleTek doesn't offer discounts, but if you do make a purchase using my link in the description, I will get a small commission that will go directly to supporting the channel, and it's super, super appreciated. You can also support the channel by purchasing some of the cool pickleball gear I've been testing out by using the links and codes in the video description below, including this t-shirt from one of my favorite apparel companies called Into the AM. And then I also have a link to my favorite pickleball gear you can get on Amazon down there as well, which has some really cool hidden gems you wouldn't expect. And then of course, hitting that like button, subscribing to the channel, and slamming that notification bell all go a long way to helping me out as well. Thank you so much for the support. But most importantly, I hope you get to pickle soon, and just don't forget, it's about having fun.